All right, let's get started. Welcome. Thank you guys for attending. Why are you here? What are we going to be learning about today? We're going to be talking about Visual Basic for Applications, or VBA for short, which is essentially a programming language that allows you to do almost anything imaginable within Microsoft Excel, as well as other Microsoft applications. It's an incredibly useful skill to have in your back pocket, as you'll see in the next hour, just because of all the things that you can do within Excel. I know that a lot of you guys don't have any VBA experience, or any coding experience for that matter, but rather than taking it slow, I'm actually going to be zooming through a lot of different topics, because my goal for this hour is to show you what coding in Excel is really capable of, so that you can decide for yourself if it's something that you'd like to explore further. Even if I were to go slow and just stick to a few basic topics, an hour probably just still wouldn't be enough. So bear with me. With that being said, the syntax of the code, meaning like the actual spelling and grammar of the code, like where do all the periods go, where do I open parentheses, close parentheses, that's not something that's really taught. It's something that you kind of just pick up over time by seeing the code over and over again. So I wouldn't really worry too much about that when you're looking through all the things that I'm going to be teaching today. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to stick to the actual logic behind the code and how to think through the sequence of the code. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. Feel free to interrupt me with any questions throughout this next hour, and let's go ahead and get started.
To start off, I want to show you guys the coding interface. So this is obviously your normal spreadsheet. Where you go to actually start coding? Well, what's funny is by default, there's a tab up here that's invisible. It's called the Developer tab. So that's a big reason why some people just don't even know that you could code in Excel, because it's invisible. So you have to actually go to the Excel options and check the box that says Show Developer tab in the ribbon. Do that, now we have this brand new tab, and you have access to a whole new set of tools. So if you click on the Visual Basic button, this will open the coding interface. This is where all of your code gets written from scratch, as well as every time you record a macro in Excel, there's code behind that also gets stored in this interface. So if you record a macro, you can also go back and see what the code looks like. That being said, everything that you can do with the click of a mouse or with your keyboard in Excel has code that corresponds to it. So if there's something that you could do in Excel with your mouse, you can code it as well. Awesome. So now, I want to show you guys really quick a real-world example that we had to do the other day, and it's this right here. It's basically a list of user accounts, account executives, and different client accounts that correspond to those users. So we have many users, and each user corresponds to multiple client accounts. And what we wanted to do is bring it into this format where you have the user ID on the left and all the accounts that correspond to it in one row to the right of the user ID. So the way that you would do that manually is pretty simple. You would just turn on the filter. You would select one user ID, and you'll see that there's several accounts that correspond to that one user ID. You would copy all of those accounts, and you would just go to your sheet, and you would paste, you would transpose it, which basically means it flips it, so it turns it from vertical into horizontal. That's the way you would do it manually. It's not hard at all. The only challenge is that you have 160 different user IDs. So that operation that I did would have had to have been done 160 times, which, it's a little time consuming. It's doable, but right now it's 160. What if tomorrow we get a whole new sheet of data and it's 570? So this is a perfect scenario where a macro comes into play, because you write the macro once and you execute it, and it performs this entire procedure, and it can be done over and over again with, every time you receive a new set of data. So I want to show you, I'm not going to go into the code because we haven't even gone over the basics, but I do want to show you what that macro looks like when you run it. So it takes a couple seconds to run, but at the end you'll see that it put everything into the format that you wanted. And the funny thing is, the macro is only a couple of lines. It's not too complicated. And you'll see when we go back into the code of this example, I'm going to point out some of the things that I've taught you in the next hour. Okay. So moving on, we're going to go into some of the basics. Okay, so here we have just some random data. And if we go into our coding interface, we're going to start writing our first macro. And you would start it off by writing the word sub, and then space, and then the name of your macro, so whatever you want to call it. In this case, I'm going to call it example. The word sub is short for subroutine, which is basically just a chunk of code that performs a given operation. Now, you'll see that if I press enter, end sub has been automatically populated, and that denotes the end of the macro. So anything that gets written in between the sub and the end sub is the actual macro. If I write anything outside of the end sub, that won't work. Awesome. Now, we want to, for our first macro, we just simply want to select cell A3, a simple select macro.
So VBA uses dots to sort of separate the different things that you can access and manipulate within the code. And it usually starts off with an object. So for example, if I had a computer, computer would be my object, and now I can either do something to the computer or I can manipulate it. I could change one of its properties. So if I wanted to give the computer a brand, I would just write computer followed by a dot, brand, and I would set it equal to Dell. So in this case, I'm changing one of the computer's properties. Now I can do that again, and I can change a different property. I can do computer.color equals blue. Now let's say now I wanted to actually do something to the computer. I would say computer .by. So in all three of these lines of code, the computer is the object. In these two lines, I'm manipulating the object. And in this line of code, I'm actually doing something to the object.
So now, going back to the macro, let's say our object in this case is the range A3, and we just want to select it. So we would write range, open parentheses, open quotes, A3, dot, select. And when I was talking to you earlier about the syntax, this is what I mean. Open parentheses, open quotes. You know, that's not something that I'm gonna really focus on, but you know, after a couple lines of code, you'll pick it up. So now to execute this macro, I would go into my macros list, and you'll see here example. That's what I named it, and I'll just click run, and you'll see now that range A3 has been selected. Now, in this case, I was doing something to the range. Now I want to change one of its properties. I'm going to give the cell a different value. Right now it says report. I'm going to change it to something else. And what I'm going to do with the previous line, I'm just going to comment it out by putting an apostrophe in the beginning of the line. You'll see it turns green. And that just basically means that any line of code that's commented out is completely ignored once the code is executed. And I just wanted to leave it up there for your reference so that I'm not deleting lines, and you know, you can see what I've put before. So now range A3, we want to change the value, and I'm going to set it equal to testing. So you see here I'm just manipulating one of the properties. Now if I execute the code, you'll see A3 has been changed. Another thing that I want to point out is I can dynamically select different cells. So for example, if I wanted to select the last cell in this column, oftentimes you want to keep everything very dynamic because when you're working with data, you never know what the last row is going to be, and you want your code to go until the very end, not until A21. But if it's A22, you want to make it dynamic. So I'm going to comment out the previous line, and what we're going to do is select the last cell, and we're going to use A3 as the anchor. So I'm going to tell the code, go to A3 and then go all the way down to the end and select that cell. So I'm going to do range A3 dot end, and in parentheses I would put what direction I want to go. I can go up, down, left, or right. And in this case I'm going to go down. And so that right there references a cell. So with that cell I want to do dot select. Okay? So if I run it, you'll see A21 has now been selected. And if I put more stuff here, the last one will always be selected. So that's really important.
What's the Excel in that background?
That's just how Microsoft decided they wanted to name it. There's a lot of things like that you just have to kind of memorize or pick it up. But for some reason there's an Excel. I don't know why. Anyway, another way I can dynamically select other cells is I can say, well, I want to select a cell starting from A3. I just want to go 2 rows down and 3 columns to the right. So in that case, I'm offsetting from one cell. I'm offsetting to another. So I go range A3 dot offset. And in parentheses, I would put how many rows down, 2, comma, how many columns to the right, 3. I'd close it out, and I'd select it. And you'll see this is 1, 2, 3 to the right, and 2 down. Okay, sweet. Now, let's say I want to select more than just one cell. If I want to select this entire range, how would I write that? I would write range A3 colon A21 dot select. Okay. I can also.
So Kevin, if you wanted to select all the way to the bottom rather than a set number, would you write A3 to Excel down?
You're ahead of me.
Oh, sorry.
Sean, you're too smart, Sean. All right, so I can also clear it. I'm also doing something to the range. You could select, you could clear it, you could do a lot of things to it. Now, I can also set the value of it all at the same time. Okay. So another way to write range A3 colon A21 is with a comma, like this. So A3, comma, A21, dot select. I'm not going to run it, but just trust me on this one that this is the same thing as this, okay? And the reason I'm showing you why you could write it this way is because, like Sean mentioned, instead of A21 here, I'm going to replace it with this right here. So I'm going to copy and paste it in right here. And that will select, so this is my starting cell, A3, and this is where I want to end, all the way down. Okay? Now, let's say I wanted to select this entire piece of data. Well, I would go all the way down, and from there I'd go all the way to the right. So if I just copy and paste this, and then after XL down, I'd do another dot, and I'd go end XL to right. And you see, Microsoft kind of helps you out. It shows you what options you have there. Okay, cool. So we've selected that. Now let's say we want to copy and paste it to a new sheet. I'm going to call this new. I'm going to tell it to copy what I've just selected, right? And my selection is now an object on its own. I'm going to tell the code to go to the new worksheet and paste it right into cell A3. So I'm going to say selection.copy, and then I'm going to access the new worksheet that we just created. I'm going to go to range A3, and I'm going to paste it.
Why did you click paste special versus paste?
For some reason, paste doesn't work because there's different ways of pasting. Like how I showed you earlier, you can transpose data, you can paste the values, you can paste the formatting. So after paste special, I can put different things like transpose equals true. Right, exactly. But if I just wanted to paste, I'll just put paste special. So everything has been pasted. Sweet. So why do I want to even bother writing code for this? I mean, a lot of you guys are probably just thinking, I mean, I can take my mouse and select this and copy and paste it to a new sheet. I'm not going to learn how to use VBA for that. Well, there's instances where it needs to be coded. For example, this worksheet that you're looking at right here was one of 60 files that all different files that we wanted to consolidate into one spreadsheet. So we had a folder of just random data files, and what I did is I wrote a macro to loop through all of these files.
Why do you want to do it? Because Sean told me to.
So in this case, I wrote a macro to open each file one by one, select everything on that sheet, copy, and paste it into one consolidated sheet. So if we open that example,
Sean, what would you do if we didn't have Kevin? Seriously.
You would have done it.
Look at that sheet.
Yes.
Manually done.
Yeah, there are 65.
So typically we would be manually doing.
We would be at the
Do you feel
river.
the data recording?
yeah, and again, in this case, there's 60 files. What if those 300? What if today's 60 is a different 60 tomorrow? You know, when you do it manually, there's really no shortcut. Macros are the best way. Anyway, if you look at the code, guys, stick with me here.
We're so excited.
Look.
Yeah.
Guys, I gotta keep you engaged. Look, I'm not gonna go too in depth into the code here, but I just want to show you. Obviously, there's some more complicated things involved here because you're looping through a folder. But what I want to show you is that essentially it's the exact same thing that I just taught you. You have a range here, and you're starting at A2, and you're going all the way down into the right here, and then you're selecting it. You're copying that selection, and then you're just pasting it right here. So essentially it's the exact same thing. There's some other things involved. Like right here you'll see this is the path of the folder in which the files live. But anyway, I just wanted to give you guys that quick example, and we'll go back to this later and you'll see how it comes full circle. So macros are not only just beneficial when you have you know, a looping scenario with a lot of data. It also, you know, is beneficial if you want to automate a certain task. Let's say you create the same report every single day and it takes you 30 minutes every day. Well, you can just write a macro. Let's say it takes you a couple hours, you know, just to write it, but then it saves you 30 minutes every day. And it doesn't have to be anything complex, but it could be, you know, select this, copy, move it around. If you have to do that every day, you know, a macro would save you time. Also, if you're doing that same process every day, you know, there's a chance you're going to make a mistake at some point. On the other hand, a macro, if you write the macro perfectly, the macro will never change. There's no human error. So that's just one of the benefits. Now, one of the next basic things that I want to touch upon is variables. I'm going to create a new macro just to go into a new topic, and I'm going to call this one variables. And it's just going to be really quick. So basically, a variable is a way to store information within your code. And a variable can be text, it can be a number, it can be a currency, it can be a date. So the type of variable depends on the nature of the content. So if I want to introduce a variable into a macro, first I would have to define it. And I do that by writing dim. And then I would write the name of the variable, and you can name it whatever you want. totally depends on how you want to organize your code. Usually, if you want to have clean code and if you have a lot of lines of code, you want to make sure you have some sort of naming convention for your variables because you're going to have a lot of variables. But in this case, I'm just going to call it my number. So I'm defining my number as an integer. So that's a very simple variable. And now I can set it equal to whatever I want. And now I'm using the variable my number to store 10. So now later on in my code, I can set my, whatever I want. Let's say a range. Equal to my number. And then, so range A2 will end up being 10. Similarly, I can define a string. So a string is text, and I can say my text, and I can make range A3 equal to the variable. So this is a very, very simple example, but it just goes to show that variables are meant for storing information, as well as solving more complex problems down the road, as you'll see. But if I run this macro, oops, I ran the wrong one. So A2 is 10 and A3 is the string that I created. Okay.
So if you accidentally put A2 in like both of the parentheses there, it would just pull an error?
It wouldn't pull an error. It would, so code gets executed line by line from top to bottom. So what would happen is A2 would be 10, and then it would be hello, and you wouldn't even see 10. So it gets executed like that. Okay, so those are really all the basics that I want to go into. Right now, I just want to show you, I want to go into user interface really quickly, and I'm not going to go too in-depth, but I want to show you that it is possible. You can create an entire user interface right on top of the spreadsheet. So for example, if I go to insert, I can create a variety of objects here. For example, a button. I can create a checkbox. I can create a text box, et cetera, et cetera. There's many different objects, and all these objects can be controlled using code as well. But mostly what I use is a button, and I use that to execute macros. So on a button click, a macro gets executed. And a button just kind of tells the user, hey, something happens when you click this, because if you code a macro into a document and you pass that document along, no one's really going to know that there's a macro behind there. So a button just kind of gives the user a visual representation of, there's something going on behind this button. So right now you'll see that I'm in design mode. So when I click the button, I can like resize it, move it around, etc. If I get outside of design mode, I can actually press the button. Right now nothing happens. But if I go back into design mode and I double click the button, it's going to take me to where to the code behind this button. So right here, I can code whatever I want, and all that will get executed once I actually press the button. So for example, I can have a little message box appear when the button gets clicked. So if I get outside of design mode and I press the button, a little message box. And message boxes also come into play when you talk about user interface. Another thing that I can do is I can have an input box appear. And an input box is similar to a message box, but it has a little box where the user can input a value and say OK. So usually an input box comes together with a question like, what size do you want, or whatever. And that value that the user inputs get used somehow. So in this case, I'm just going to spit that value right back out into cell A1 just to show you what an input box looks like. So I would say range A1 dot value is equal to input box, and in parentheses I put whatever question. So this will be the value of whatever the user inputs. So this is what an input box looks like. There you go. Okay. Last thing in regards to the user interface is I can create a user form, is what it's called, and it's basically just a little window that you can design and manipulate. So if I right click and go to insert user form, this is practically what a blank user form looks like, and I can throw a label in there. I can put a text box. I can put a button. I can put a drop-down menu. You can customize it however you want. And you'll see by default it's called user form 1. So if I go back to the button, the code behind the button, I can just say on this button click, I want my user form 1 to show. And that's the form that I just created. And obviously you can change all the colors and you can do whatever you want, and then you could prompt the user to do certain things, and then, that can be used various different ways. Okay, sweet. So now I'm going to go back to a previous example, the report on reports. And this is the
Report on report.
Yeah. That's what we created. We named this macro, and that was the one that looped through all the files and consolidated them into one spreadsheet. So if I open it back up, you'll see what I've done now is I created a very, very, very basic user interface, which is essentially a button and a screenshot. So it's the most basic UI you can find out there. But what this has done, it has created a macro that I wrote, to perform a manual task that I didn't want to do, and I've created this macro into a tool that anyone can use. So you'll see that before I had the path of the folder that the files live in was stuck in the code. So if I gave that macro to someone and said, hey, you can use this, they would have had to have gone into the macro, into the code itself, to edit the folder's address. And that obviously, if that person doesn't know what they're doing, or if they mess up with, one character, there could be problems. So what I did is I eliminated that step for the user. So I made it into a tool that anyone could use. So when you click go, it prompts you with an input box to paste the address of the folder, right? So I go to the folder, and I copy the address at the top. I paste it into the box, and I say OK. And now that runs. And you see at the bottom of the screen how each file is opening and closing, opening and closing. It's opening, it's copying everything, it's pasting, it's closing, and moves on to the next one. I'm just going to press escape so we're not sitting here. But going back to the code, you'll see that I've commented out this previous line where I actually put the address of the folder. And now I said it's just going to be equal to an input box. And that input box is going to appear when I click the button. So it's a very simple concept, but it does so much for the user. And now I can pass this file along to a colleague, to my client, and say, hey, you could use this too. All right, so now I'm going to move on to some logic. And I know that I'm going really fast, but this is kind of just the way that it has to be for me to get through all the material that I want to get through.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there a macro that they can write to get someone else to write this for me who understands it?
You send me an email.
I don't know how to answer that.
All right, so if statements. If I have an if statement in my code, I'm telling it to execute a chunk of the code only if a certain condition is met. So, for example, the way that I would write that is I would say if, and I'd write my condition here, then, so right here you would write whatever condition you want to be checked. So it could be something along the lines of if a certain cell equals a particular value, then we want something to occur. So I would write whatever code I'd want to execute within the if statement, and then I would close the if statement with an end if at the bottom. So the way this would work is you probably have a couple lines of code up here. So the code will execute line by line. It'll go down this list. Once it hits the if statement, it'll check this condition right here. If this happens to be true, then it'll go within the if statement, it'll execute all the code in here, and then it'll come out of the if statement and it'll continue along its merry way. Now, what happens is, if this ends up being false, then instead of going within the if statement, the code will get to this point and it'll go past the entire if statement. And it'll just skip past it and it'll continue down this way. So the main difference is whether this is going to be true or false.
What I want to do in this example is I want to write an if statement that says if cell B2 says the word registered, then we'll do something. Maybe we'll have a message box pop up. That sounds fun. So I'm going to call this sub if statement, the name of my macro, completely arbitrary. And I'm going to say if range, what is it, B2 dot value equals registered, then, see, I didn't close the quotes here, so it gave me an error. Then, I want a message box to appear. And I'm going to close the if statement. Okay? So, I go back and I try to run this. I won because it actually does say registered. Okay? If I delete the content of that cell and I try to run it, what's going to happen? Nothing. Nothing. Because it goes past the if statement and there's nothing past it anyway, so nothing happens. Okay? Now, what if I wanted to say, okay, well, if it says registered, you won. If it says anything else, if it says registered without the D, anything other than what I've put in these quotation marks, and you lose. I would write, well, if it says registered, you win, else, message box. Sure. What's that? Oh. Oh, okay. Okay. So that's how you write that. So going back to the macro, if I run it, I should lose because it does not say register.
Okay, so that's all that I wanted to talk about in regards to if statements. Now I'd like to jump into some loops. So as I mentioned earlier, each line in the code gets executed one by one until you reach the end of the macro. If I want to go back to a previous line in the code, then I have to force the program to do so, and I do that by using a loop. Now, the reason why I want to use a loop is so that I can perform a chunk of code repeatedly a number of times. So the way you would write that is, let's say your loop starts right here, and I'll show you how to actually write the loop, but let's just say it starts right here, and you have your code within the loop right here, and then the loop ends, let's say, right there. So everything within the loop is what gets executed. That is one iteration. So let's say you have a couple lines of code up here. So these lines get executed, and it comes down, and it hits the beginning of the loop. It goes within the loop, it executes everything here, this one iteration. It gets to the end of the loop, and it comes back to the beginning. And it executes this again, and it reaches the end of the loop, and it goes back to the beginning. And it executes all of this, does this whole process until a certain condition has been met. There's a way to write that into the loop. In fact, if you write an infinite loop, the macro will actually end up crashing, and your computer might catch on fire or something. So you want to make sure that your loop ends at some point.
Let's say I wanted to go through this entire list. Let's say I wanted to go through this entire list and count the number of times that it says registered. So how many employees are actually registered for their course? What I will need to do is create a loop that starts at the top, and within each iteration, in one iteration, it's going to check if the cell says registered. So I'm going to use an if statement. If the cell is registered, I'm going to have a count variable. So I'm going to have an integer variable that stores the number of people that are registered. So it's going to say if it's registered, I'm going to add 1 to that variable. And then I'm going to loop back, and in the next iteration, I'm going to check the next cell on the list. And again, if it's registered, add 1. And it's going to continue all the way down to the end. And the way that I would have the loop go down the list is I would have a separate variable that counts the number of the iteration that we're at. So that one gets increased by 1 with each cell that we go down. So essentially, I'm using the top cell, B1, as my anchor, and I'm offsetting 1 cell down the list for each iteration.
Why would you want to loop in that instance? Is there any way to write a macro that would just do like a count-if function so that you could do it all simultaneously? Or maybe that's what a count-if function does in the back.
There's many ways to accomplish the same procedure. I just wanted a very simple example for looping, and this is just one way to do it. And in a lot of situations within loops, you want to count and you want to have variables, and I felt this was a very comprehensive example. But like I said, pretty much anything that you can do with the mouse and the keyboard on the spreadsheet can be coded as well. So yeah, you could do a count-if, and that works too.
Okay, so the way I'm going to code this procedure is I'm going to have cell B1 at the top. So B1 is going to act as my anchor, and to check all of the cells below it, I'm going to offset down from this cell. So I have a bunch of cells that fall within this column under B1, right? And on this side, I'm going to have my variable I, which I named it I because it stands for the number of the iteration that we're at. But I could call this variable whatever I want. I just chose I. So not only is it the number of the iteration that we're at within the loop, it's also going to be the number of cells that we're offsetting down from our anchor of B1. So when we're here, we're offsetting 1 cell down, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now on this side, I want to have my variable count, which I'm going to start off at 0. So count is going to be the number of people that are registered in this list. So every time I go down the list and I'm in one iteration, I'm going to check if that cell is registered. If it is, I'm going to add 1 to my count variable. And at the end, this is going to be my result, the amount of people that are actually registered. So starting off at 0, let's say I go down the very first cell, I'm at the first iteration, and I'm also offsetting 1 cell down. This person does in fact happen to be registered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 1 to my count variable. So now we're at 1. We go down this list, this guy is not registered, this person is. So now I'm going to add 1 to my count. We're at 2. And let's say the fifth cell also is registered. So now I add 1 and my count is 3. So my answer is right here. There's 3 people that are registered. And that's what I want to spit out.
The way I would write that out is I would create a new macro. And I would say, well, I want to define my I. I also want to define the count. Count is 0. I is starting off at 1 because the first cell that we're checking is 1 down from the top. If I could use this one as my anchor. In that case, I would do 0 to begin with. So it just depends where you want to start off.
Tell what happens if you don't put a count in? It's not defaulted. The count number where it should start.
You're saying if I say count, did you say this line count equals 0?
Yeah, if you just took that out.
Yes, it would be defaulted to 0, but
Best practice.
exactly, best practices. You want to have clean code. Okay. So there's 2 different types of loops I'm going to go over today. The first one is a for loop, and so I would write for I equals 1 to 20, and 20 because there's about like 20 rows that we want to go through. So this designates the stopping point of the loop. It's going from I equals 1 all the way to 20. So every time it loops back to the beginning, which will be this line right here, it's going to check if I is 20. Once it hits 20, it's going to exit the loop. So that's what a for loop does. And a for loop automatically increments or increases I by 1 with each iteration. So if range B1 offset, how many rows down am I offsetting? I rows down, because that's going to be dynamic. It's going to be a different number every iteration. So if it says registered, what do we want to do? And we want to add 1 to the count. And the way you would write that is a little tricky. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. But what you would say is that the new count is equal to the old count plus 1. You would end the if. And then the way to close the loop, to tell us to go back to the top, you would just write next, and that word next is specific to a for loop. So the next type of loop, there's a different word to close the loop at the bottom. So this is 100% correct. This is accurate. This macro works. It counts the number of registered people. What's wrong with it, though?
Doesn't tell you where to put your answer?
Exactly. So if I were to run this macro, it would work, but I would still have no idea what the count is. So I have to spit it out somewhere. I could put it in a cell. I could put it in a message box. I could do whatever I want with it. In this case, you'll notice I really like message boxes. So it says 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's right. So the other way we can write this is with a different type of loop, and that loop is called a do until loop. So a do until is basically keep performing this loop until whatever condition has been met. And the condition I'm going to use is I want to do this loop until I reach a blank cell. So that's going to be my condition. So do until range B1 dot offset I0 dot value equals nothing. The way I would close the loop at the bottom is just by writing the word loop. The difference between the do until and the for is that the for loop automatically increases I by 1 with each iteration. The do until does not. So I have to manually increase I by 1. think I'm in the wrong macro. Okay, well, exactly. Works just the same as the previous one. Now, I don't have to do until I hit a blank cell. I can do until whatever I want. I could say do until I equals 5. So basically just do 5 iterations. If I run that, so now the amount of people that are registered are 3 within the first 5 iterations. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is where it stops, and you have 3 people that are registered up until that point. Okay. Are there any questions?
Do you put macros in other languages besides VBA? Like, could you do SQL or anything else?
Nope. Visual Basic is a Microsoft programming language. This is a Microsoft application, and
It's just the way they do it.
that's how the world works, my friend. Okay. I want to go back really quickly to the previous example that I started off the workshop with. So if you guys remember, this was the example where we wanted to get it into this format by simply filtering, selecting our user, copying the accounts, and transposing it. Right? That was the operation. Now I'm going to show you the code behind this, and I think you might understand it, because all we're doing is we're performing that operation. Everything that I just did with my mouse was one iteration. Now I'm looping through this list on the left, and I'm performing that same operation for each user. So we check out the code. You'll see I have a do until, and I'm doing it until a1.offset I down is blank, so until I have no more users. And I wouldn't worry too much about it, but essentially you can see there's a filter line of code. I'm selecting, I'm copying, and I'm pasting it. I'm transposing it. And then I'm increasing I by 1, and I'm looping back until I have no more users. Okay. Why does recording a macro have certain limitations? Why would I code a macro? Why wouldn't I just record one? If I record a macro, if I want to record a macro that says I want to select the entirety of this data, and I press record and I select it, and then I stop recording, what's the code behind that going to look like?
1 through 20.
It's going to say select cells A1 to B20 and select only those. If tomorrow my data goes up to the 25th row, it's going to still select up to 20. So you can't make dynamic macros by recording them. You also can introduce loops, if statements, etc.
If you record though, can't you go back in and change the coding? I thought you could.
Yeah. So that Shelly brings up a really good point, is that when you're first starting off, or even down the road, you can use recorded macros, maybe alter a couple of things, and you can get away with that. And a lot of people, I do that. If I have no idea how to, do some conditional formatting, some random line of code, I'll record a macro, I'll see what it looks like, and then I can alter it, I can change it up a bit. If I want to make a cell, background yellow, I can figure out how to code that as well by recording it first. So that's a really good point. So what is a decision support system is kind of one of the last things I want to touch upon. A decision support system is more than just a macro that automates a certain task or a little tool that performs a very specific operation. A decision support system is a complete user interface that allows the user, it guides the user to make a decision. And oftentimes you have an overwhelming amount of information, and you need to consolidate all that. You need to make it intuitive and user-friendly. So I want to show you a quick example of a project that I worked on not too long ago. So this is what it's all about. This is really one of the beauties of macros, is when you can come up with things like this. So what this is the initial dashboard, and this entire decision support system is made to allow the user to create balanced teams of employees for a given set of projects. So let's say you have your employee database, right? You have all your employees, and you have different characteristics, and you rank them at each one, and each person's different. And then you have, as a company, you have your database of projects that are available. So you have different projects. How many people do we need for each project? What kind of skills are we looking for that specific project? And someone needs to create down teams of employees. So you go and you use something like this, and you go to your project dashboard, and you have your projects available right here, and you can select one of the projects, and you can say, I'm going to draft an initial draft of teams for this particular project. And what the decision support system is going to do, or DSS is what we call it, it's going to do an initial draft based on a simple algorithm, and it's going to give the user a really good starting point, and it's going to create teams for the users. But what a DSS is not, it's not an easy button. It's not a magical formula. It's not a, this is the ultimate answer. It's meant to guide the user. So it gives you a starting point. It allows the user to customize all the teams, to swap people, to see all of the metrics and how everything gets changed. So you see here on the left, these are all the different teams, the names of their employees. You have different metrics, and if I want to, swap some employees, I can select one. I can add them to my swap box. I can select another one, do the same. And before I actually make the transition, before I actually even decide to swap those employees, it'll show me how the metrics change before I even do that. And let's say there's 3 greens and 2 reds, so that looks like it would be a good swap, and I can just swap them, and they would change. And essentially, it guides the user to a solution, but keeps the user in control, and that's what a DSS is. And this is really some advanced stuff, but that's where macros really shine. All right. In closing, a couple of resources for you. If you think that VBA is for you, if it's something that you want to explore further and learn more about, I would say, first of all, you could always kind of rely on Google. No one person can know all the different lines of code and how to code different things. So if there's something that you want to code and you're really not sure, it could be something as simple as changing, the font size. The key word to put in the search term is VBA, and you'll get the results that you're looking for. In addition, I'm going to send you guys, perhaps tomorrow, a big file that has a lot of code within it, including everything that I showed you guys today, and some other things, and there'll be comments there, so you can, I'll explain this is how you filter, this is how you change the font size, etc. That'll be a good resource. There's a lot of, free online classes and websites. I'll send you a couple links, but there's a ton of them. Accenture has some VBA training, as well as I would be a good resource. I'm set to expire on August 8th.
Don't die on us.
After that, we can work on an hourly basis. But seriously, if you want to learn VBA, I would say that right now is the best time while I'm still here for the next 5 weeks. And yes, it's only 5 weeks, but I'm still here while you're going through that initial learning process. So I would say right now is the best time to start learning. I have no problem sitting down with you, and if you're having questions about your code or whatever. Also, if you're like Brian, you really don't care about learning VBA, but you think you have an issue that can be solved with a macro, I'm happy to help with that as well, and we can use that as a learning opportunity for you as well. So I think that's all that I wanted to get through. Is there any last minute questions? All right.